In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Well, hello, Sublation Media viewers. It's I, Douglas Lane. I am the host of the Sublation Magazine show. I am the head of Sublation Media and the author of a short story called A Coffee Cup Alien Invasion Story, which we will discuss later on in the stream. I suggested that we discuss a short story every week, and I'm going to take advantage of that and put my own up right away. With me today, Benjamin Studebaker. Ben, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker. I'm a political theorist. I did my PhD at Cambridge. I've written a couple of books about legitimacy and democracy, the chronic crisis of American democracy, the way it's shut, and legitimacy in liberal democracies with the fun Hydra cover. That's what I do.
Well, I want to hear about your second book, because I've read The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, but I have not even glanced at your, what was the title again? Hold that second book up again.
Yeah, Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, just out at the end of November. Very new, very fresh.
I feel like the question of legitimacy is on my mind, so maybe we can talk about that a little bit in this stream. It seems somehow relevant to A Coffee Cup Alien Invasion Story to me. I don't know. But let's start off with Syria. You suggested that we discuss the situation in Syria. A lot of people on the left, it seems like it's dropped out of the news altogether. It was there for a moment. It was a blip. Something happened in Syria. Assad was gone. He rushed off to Moscow. And then that's really the last I heard about it. But where would you want to begin if you were going to start to explain what's happened, or explain what is happening in Syria today?
Well, I would go back to the Arab Spring in 2011, right? That's where that civil war began, as part of a series of different revolutionary moments in the Middle East. The government in Tunisia, Ben Ali's regime collapsed. The government of Mubarak in Egypt collapsed. With an American intervention in Libya, the government of Gaddafi collapsed. And there were protests. There were disturbances in many other states. And of course, in Syria, a civil conflict got going. And relatively early on in the Arab Spring, it became clear to the United States that these revolutions were not necessarily producing liberal institutionalist regimes. It was not necessarily, as the United States had perhaps hoped, the spreading of democracy throughout the Middle East in a kind of domino theory after Iraq. And so more Islam-oriented leaders started winning the elections in these countries. There were concerns about terrorist groups potentially taking power in these states. And so the United States decided in the case of Syria not to push Assad out aggressively as it had done with Gaddafi in Libya. And so instead, a kind of power vacuum opened up in Syria with a weak Syrian state fighting for survival. And then in neighboring Iraq, a weak Iraqi state that had limited military capability because the United States had just withdrawn from Iraq. This allowed the Islamic State to become established in the desert region, the low population region in between the two states. And then that spurred the Obama administration to permit Russia to intervene on behalf of Assad so as to consolidate the power base of the Syrian state for the purposes of destroying the Islamic State. And the United States, Russia, and Turkey cooperated to destroy the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Once the Islamic State was gone, there was much less reason to want Assad around. And indeed, because Assad is friendly with Iran, Assad staying in power permitted weapons to continue to flow to Hezbollah through Syria. And so Hezbollah grew and became much stronger during the period in which the Syrian civil war was taking place. And so the reasons to keep Assad around diminished as the Islamic State weakened and as Hezbollah became a bigger problem for Israel. At the same time, the capacity of Russia to aid Assad decreased as Russian forces became tied up in Ukraine. And then, after the conflict kicked off in Gaza, Hezbollah was tied up fighting with the Israelis, and Hezbollah took enormously big, shocking losses against Israel. So this produced a situation where the Russians were not equipped to reinforce Assad. Hezbollah was not equipped to reinforce Assad. And all of a sudden, Assad could be pushed off with something like a feather. Now, how involved is the United States in pushing the particular new guy who used to be and is still on the terrorism list, is classified by the United States as a terrorist? How involved is the United States in encouraging him, in arming him? It wouldn't take a lot of weapons to arm him, given the weakness of the Russian position and the position of Hezbollah at this stage. So it's not as if a very large amount of weapons would necessarily need to be transferred to him. Nevertheless, there is a U.S. military base in Syria. There are Turkish forces in Syria. This guy is not able to take power in Syria without these other entities, Israel, the United States, and Turkey, at the very least permitting it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there will probably be some kind of deal in which perhaps Israel and Turkey get some territory from Syria in exchange for permitting this new government to take power. And the new government will do various things to reassure the United States and other nearby states of a commitment to liberal institutionalism, inclusive institutions, credible institutions, all of that. And perhaps Syria will stop being a conduit for Iranian weapons, which would greatly weaken the ability of Hezbollah to, in the future, open up any second fronts, strengthening very much Israel's free hand in Gaza. But there's a lot of questions about exactly how did this go down? How involved was the United States directly in this? Or is this something that that the United States permitted to happen that would have happened on its own in any case? It's very difficult to figure it out because the information is very bad and the media doesn't seem concerned to try to figure any of it out. The mainstream press in the United States is remarkably disinterested in what's going on in Syria. Even though it's a wild story, this is a state that was intact despite everything for more than 10 years, and then all of a sudden was gone in the blink of an eye, and nobody seems to care. And I find that part, the part that nobody cares, the most interesting part.
Well, let me ask you a couple questions. Before we started the stream, I did a bit of last-minute Destiny-style research. You know, I read Wikipedia articles, I looked at news articles, and I came up with a list of players. There's a Syrian National Army that has taken control. There's the HTS, which I think is aligned with Al-Qaeda. There's the Kurds. There's a new Syrian army, and that's a U.S.-backed faction, but maybe aligned with the Mujahideen as well, have players from the Mujahideen. And there's something called the Southern Operations Room. Which of these factions, am I leaving anything out? Is this a fair accounting of the forces that toppled Assad's regime?
Well, the reason I didn't frame it this way is that it's so difficult to figure out exactly who is funded by whom and who's getting what from where. So if you do a list of factions, they're all going under different names that are intended to brand them in different ways or to persuade different constituencies of different lanes. At this point, Syria has become this enormous mess, in large part because so many external states have gotten involved in it. And so there are so many groups in Syria that have some kind of puppet relationship to some external state, which is why when I talk about it, I just start talking about Russia, Turkey, Israel, the United States. And then the various rebel groups are in a position where they have to make alliances with those various foreign states or with the UAE or with the Iranians. You know, they have to make alliances with various states. And The Assad regime made alliances with Russia and Iran. The various rebel groups were in a situation where they couldn't persuade very many of the foreign states, apart from some of the Gulf states, to support them. And so this limited their ability to gain ground. They couldn't get the United States to intervene to topple Assad. They couldn't get the United States to provide them directly with weapons. The United States showed a willingness to use the Kurds or use the Turks as an alternative to working with them. So gradually over time, this appears to have changed their position. They have become willing to, at the very least, pretend to be less interested in Islamism than they seem to have been interested in it 5-10 years ago. Is that rebranding? Are they telling the truth? What's actually going on there? I think we're in the realm of you need actual military intelligence to really be able to parse it. And I think that's in part why the media is not covering it. I think that insofar as there are facts that we are not meant to have at this point.
Well, my impression, now I'm not in any way a scholar or very informed on the total history in the region, but my impression is that the Ba'athist Party and Assad were kind of were socialists of a type, that it represented at the outset some sort of nationalist project for self-determination and more egalitarian ways of living within the society, and that was that they weren't. I mean, that's my impression. And I'm not saying that's where they ended up, but the other faction would have been Islamist. It seems to me that's really the only other. I mean, you've got the Baathists, who are these authoritarians, and they also accommodate Islamism to different degrees, but then you've got the straight ahead, like Muslim Brotherhood Islamists.
Yeah.
Am I totally wrong?
It's very difficult to try to classify in that way, because the Baathists, and the Baathists, of course, were also the party of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, right?
Right.
The Baathists were for the longest time in Syria allied to the Iranians, right? And not only were they allied to the Iranians, but within Syria, there's a sect, the Alawite Shiite sect, that is kind of the core power base for Assad. And it's a small minority of the Syrian population. Yet this small minority tended to be heavily economically favored by the state. So I would not describe the Assad regime as secularist in the sense of, say, abiding by a fair equality of opportunity regardless of denomination or group. That would not describe the Assad regime. Baathism has a kind of formal ideological commitment to secularism. But in practice, if you were an Alawite, you did much better under Assad than you did if you were a Sunni. There was a sectarian quality to that regime. So a lot of people are on the left are really just interested in upping any state that's anti-American. The reason to potentially back Assad or to permit Assad from the American point of view was to prevent a power vacuum from opening up in which something like the Islamic State could get going. And that was the argument back in, say, 2014 for not toppling Assad, that it would produce the kind of vacuum that you were seeing at that time in Libya. And now at this point, with the Islamic State gone, and with all of these neighboring states having very much established presences within Syria, both formally and informally through proxies and patsies, it's just a very different situation. But this is something that emerged very slowly over time. And I think for most of us who only check in on this intermittently when it's in the news or when something seems to be happening, it was a big surprise how much it had changed. Because for years and years and years and years, it had seemed to be more or less the same situation. If you're one of the map bros who goes and looks at these war maps and argues on the subreddits about the war maps, it had seemed like nothing had happened for a very, very long period of time. And then all of a sudden, it's a totally different situation. And the only way that can happen is for there to be information that people who are trying to follow the conflict closely don't have. And I think that's wild. We have a situation where there's a chunk of people who are committed to one side or the other in that conflict because they have family or what have you in Syria. And these people try to follow it closely, but it's really, really difficult for them because the quality of information just isn't that good. The governments don't release very much of the information that you would need to know what's going on. And this is something I think also that has probably tended to be true in the past, that with wars, there's a bit of a fog of war aspect where even with a lot of media reporting, you don't tend to really get a very good sense for what's going on in a war just by following news reports. They tend to be very incomplete. And I think and this has something to do with Twitter and our expectation that what we're getting is detailed and forensic in a way that it's not. We're thinking that anybody can post online and tell you about what's going on. So we should know what's going on. That's not how it seems to work in these wars.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to stick with this question about Baathism and socialism. I mean, obviously, or secular society. But in the Arab Spring, there was a hope on the left and in the West that these uprisings would lead to democracy or liberalization, secularization, more equality, and amongst the far left, maybe even they would lead the way for Westerners to rise up against their own unfair regimes. The Occupy movement was somewhat inspired by what happened in Egypt, and came, on the heels of the Arab Spring. So there was a kind of a hope for international transformation, and dare I say it, even revolution amongst the left in 2011. Okay, and so I think we should remember that. I mean, maybe that was just my delusion, but I don't think it was just
that was a delusion. That was a big delusion that people had. That was totally delulu. There were neoconservatives in the Bush administration who thought that perhaps this would be like something like the fall of the Soviet Union, and that it would lead to liberal democratic revolutions all over the place. But I think people who were imagining that Mubarak in Egypt is the beginning of a worldwide revolution in 2011 were completely out of touch with reality. I will say that one of the things that put me off Occupy and convinced me that it was a total waste of time was going out to St. Paul's in London in 2011 as an undergraduate student and finding people who were there ostensibly to talk about the banking system or the finance capital, instead reading like slam poems about Egypt. And this convinced me that these people were losers and that they were never going to change anything.
Right. But I understand. But, the left had trained itself to look elsewhere for the spark that would set off worldwide change. And so you see the people of Egypt rising up against their oppressor, and you think, hey, maybe they can teach us how we could do that. Or, maybe the energy from that will transform the West eventually as well.
Yeah. What's even more regressed now is that people don't think the revolutionaries in these countries are signs of something positive to come. They think the dictators in these countries are signs of something positive to come. So now, instead of being for the revolutionaries, they're just for preserving these regimes that are can only be preserved with an enormous amount of violence, because they are these very small states that are subsisting through neighboring states choosing to back them or support them in various ways. A lot of the states in the Middle East are not states that would exist. One might say, I'm going to use a term artfully here, organically. These are not states that would exist without other more powerful states insisting that they exist and defining them as having these borders and then protecting and policing these borders in various ways. There are several states in the Middle East that are actually big enough and strong enough to potentially be power bases in their own right. Turkey, Iran, Egypt. A lot of the states that exist in between those states, it's not clear if they would exist without various kinds of support from outside.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, at the beginning, the colonial project was what created these nations, right? After the Ottoman Empire collapsed and was annexed after World War One. So it's not so surprising, I guess, that even now there's a quality of precarity in the region for most of the smaller nations, and even maybe for the bigger ones. But I guess what I wanted to ask is about the working class in Syria. And as a socialist, I'm looking to the situation and saying, is there an opportunity for a better life for workers, and is there an opportunity here for a different kind of political organizing in Syria? And I look into it a little bit, and just like unemployment rate is like 13 to 14%. 70 to 90% of the Syrian population lives in poverty, and most of the Syrian workers don't live in Syria. They've been scattered throughout the world at this point. So I look into the industries in Syria that produces crude oil. That's the number one export. And then
Actually, in terms of the amount of oil they have, it's quite limited compared to other states nearby. This is a state that's economy has been extraordinarily battered by more than a decade of war. So the industries that are currently leading there are not the industries that would be leading if the country were actually rebuilt. At this point, aside from things like resource extraction, a lot of other economic sectors have collapsed because there's simply no longer a very large number of people who are able to be organized in such a way that those sectors can function. If you think about it, you have a 13% unemployment rate, even though enormous numbers of people have fled the country. Mm-hmm. Think of how dysfunctional an economy has to be to produce an unemployment rate that high when the population of the state has been collapsing due to emigration continuously for over 10 years. So what is currently going on in Syria has nothing to do, I think, with what will eventually be going on there once the war actually ends. That's the question. The question is, can this new government actually end the civil war and produce some kind of order? Because almost any kind of order at this point would be better economically for people who live in Syria than what has been going on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you think that the question then comes down to which of the foreign interests will succeed in Syria, or to the degree to which there can be cooperation between these major power players like the Iranians and the Turks and the Americans?
There's got to be some kind of deal here. Because what has been happening is that for various reasons, the United States has decided it's not in its interest to just pick a winner and bring order there. The United States has instead allowed there to be contestation going on there. Because the United States didn't think the rebels were worth backing and didn't think that Assad was worth backing, it backed off of the area and allowed other states to play in it. Mm-hmm. And then these states competed with each other, and this kept the war going and made it worse in various ways, to the point where the actual domestic forces in Syria became a relatively small percentage, much smaller than you would expect, of the overall military capability deployed in the territory. So I think we have reached a point where it's really a question of, is the United States going to back the new government? Will the new government behave in such a way that the United States is comfortable backing it? And this is why there's all this question about, will they have credible and inclusive institutions? Or will they behave in such a way that the United States will back them? Because only the United States can stop the contestation from occurring. This window is a kind of fruitful window for pro-American forces in Syria, because right now the Russians are not able to be involved in the way that they have been. The Iranians and the Lebanese are not able to be involved in the way that they have been. So it's a potential opportunity for a deal to be cut among the other players that would stabilize the region. But this is what they have to do. The rebel leader has to find a modus vivendi with the West, and then he has to make whatever concessions are necessary to get the Turks and the Israelis to stop looking to pilfer more of the territory. So he has to give up potentially some land to them, or he has to, in some other way, shape, or form, meet their various security demands. The Turks are not necessarily going to trust a Syrian government to manage the Kurds. From the Turkish point of view, Syria and Iraq have become places where Kurdish rebels can organize freely and potentially then make interventions in Turkey to cause trouble for Turkey. So Turkey is quite keen on getting some real order going on. And if it's not convinced that real order is occurring, it will potentially take the territory so that it can control that Kurdish population directly.
Mm-hmm.
There's always the question of Kurdistan and whether something like a Kurdistan could be created, but Turkey is very much opposed to that. Turkey does not want a state for Kurds from which Kurdish rebels in Turkey can be continuously rearmed. So, it's a difficult question whether they can cut a deal that will result in stability. I think a lot of people who are skeptical think that ultimately the rebel government will show its true colors and return to some kind of hard Islamism. But if they do that, won't that just produce more civil conflict that's very likely to get them killed? I think it probably would. At this point, Israel, the United States, and Turkey have boots on the ground in the territory. So there's certain discrete, concrete facts here that work against the rebel leaders returning to some kind of Islamist posture, unless they're not reasonable people who don't care that they might be killed if they do that. But I don't think that the appropriate way to think about Middle Eastern conflicts is to assume that one side or the other is unreasonable. Even the groups that we think of as Islamist are usually pretty reasonable when it comes to responding thoughtfully to concrete material situations that exist on the ground. And the central and basic facts here are the presence of the United States, Turkey, and Israel in Syrian territory.
When you say the presence of the United States, you don't mean actual U.S. troops or forces, do you? Or do you?
There's a U.S. military base. There's a military base.
Okay. But you're primarily talking about the new Syrian army.
I'm primarily talking about a system of logistical support whereby American interests can be projected militarily in the region.
So it's a matter of weapons,
States, yes, and capacity to realize the American state's will in the territory. There is capacity. The thing is that Obama did not choose to use that capacity. And then for a while, that capacity was mainly used to weaken the Islamic State. Remember, we were bombing the Islamic State in Syria. Mm-hmm. We were drone striking and targeting. So there's U.S. military forces deployed in the territory, not just on the ground in the military base, but in the air, over the territory. The Americans are involved, not in a way which puts many Americans' lives in immediate danger. It's not a large number of Americans out doing patrols in Humvees, but there is certainly a capacity to project American state power in Syria.
Yeah, after October 7th, on the left, there has been, amongst those who are hoping for a multipolar world and the end of the American imperial system, there was a hope that as each front in the different conflicts in Ukraine and in Israel and Gaza and Hezbollah and Lebanon, that this would put so much pressure on the United States that it would start to crack. But it seemed like the opposites happened in fact, that the pressure put on Iran and on Russia was enough to contain their regional ambitions. Do you think that's fair?
You know, Doug, there's an old saying down in Texas. I think it's in Tennessee, but it's also in Texas that goes, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice. You get fooled, you can't get fooled again.
Won't get fooled again. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that's a George W. Bushism. That's what that is. Yeah.
There's a big chunk of people on the American left who keep telling us over and over and over again that these other states are about to get all these big wins and score all these stunning victories. And then it doesn't happen. And then not only does it not happen, but often instead the Americans get what they're looking for out of the situation. And then they just ignore the fact that this happened and they go on peddling the same stuff in subsequent situations without learning anything. I think we have to recognize that the information that the kind of alt-left media is using to analyze what's going on in these different situations is not good information. Is that because it's information that's been fed to them by outside malicious actors? Is it because the information that's publicly available is just insufficient to judge the case? I don't know. But what I can tell you is that the predictions that these people have been making about Ukraine, about Syria, about Israel have been consistently wrong over and over and over again. And in each of these cases, the American position has been, and what the Americans have been saying about the situations has been much closer to what has actually then taken place. The Americans have tended to get what they want. And when the Americans have made claims about what's going on, those claims have been more likely to be right. Now, it's not a question of whether you want it one way or the other way. It's not a question of sides. It's a question of who's giving you information that actually reflects what's happening. And the sad situation that we're in right now is that the American intelligence services and the American establishment media that puts out reports that come directly from those intelligence services has been more reliable in terms of its coverage on these cases than the alternative media has been. And we have to ask why that is.
So if you were to compare, I don't know, someone like Rachel Maddow to Jeffrey Sachs as he makes the rounds on various podcasts, who would you turn to be more reliable on foreign policy questions?
Oh God, does it have to be Maddow? How about just the New York Times or the Washington Post?
Okay,
right?
There you go. Okay.
At this stage, I think you would get more reliable and better information on Ukraine, on Syria, on Israel from the New York Times or the Washington Post than you would from most of the alternative media sources. In terms of just facts, in terms of just what's happening, what's likely to happen, who's winning, what are the casualty rates, it seems, based on what's been taking place, that information is more reliable. And this means either we are making big claims on the basis of inadequate information. We don't actually have the facts, and we're engaging in various kinds of wishful thinking or stupid thinking, right? Or it means that some of the people in this space are getting their information perhaps from other state actors who are motivated to try to get them to think about the conflict in other ways.
Right. No, I don't disagree. The other thing that comes to mind, though, is we just had an election that to some degree was thought to be a referendum on our U.S. foreign policy. But the left believed that it was a referendum on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the U.S. backing of Israel. Most people on the right, or the center to the right, would have said it was more of a referendum on the U.S. support for Ukraine and the conflict with Russia.
All of the data we have says it was a referendum on immigration and the cost of living. All of the actual data in which you ask people, why are you voting the way that you're voting, says that what they care about is immigration and the cost of living. But leave it to the alternative media on the internet to not pay any attention to that data, to not even attempt to explain that data in terms of their own view. To just go, well, data is fake, and polling and social science, it's all fake. Whatever it is that we wish is true, we'll just say that it is true over and over again. And no matter what happens or in what ways we're subsequently proven wrong by the course of events, we'll just keep insisting on whatever it is that we wish is true. I mean, it's not news at this point. It's not journalism. It's not reporting. It's become something else.
I thought like third, fourth, maybe fifth down on the list, there was concern about Ukraine in the polling, that in the exit polls. I mean, certainly you're right that the primary issues were cost of living, and immigration.
And then abortion and the state of democracy were higher than foreign policy.
Right. Yeah, right. But state of democracy tended to swing the other way. People who thought that democracy was in crisis were not likely to vote for Trump and for the team that won. But yeah, those were major issues.
Yeah, if you were to just go, what were the most important issues for voters? All of the social science that has been done since the election would put cost of living, immigration up at the top, then abortion and the state of democracy for the Harris voters. And then you can maybe start to get to foreign policy after that. But you're not going to have the same level of concern in society about foreign policy when you don't have American troops deployed and getting killed and casualty reports in the news. You are just not going to get the same level of concern from the American population that you had in the mid-2000s during the Iraq War. And why would anybody expect it to be otherwise? And then people start moralizing about it. They go, well, you should care about it. Well, that's not going to accomplish anything. You can run around and tell people what they should care about all you want. It doesn't produce political action. It just makes you look like one of those technocrats who tells people what to do.
Well, my feeling was that during the campaign that when Trump would say that Biden had put us closer to a nuclear conflict than any time since not the Bay of Pigs, but the Cuban Missile Crisis, that had some traction with portions of his base, say that was rhetorically effective, that there was concern about that conflict careening out of control, and ICBM missiles landing in Toledo or something like that, but perhaps not in the majority of voters' minds. But
the weird thing about that conflict is that for some reason, the Biden administration thinks it can do things over there that would just be nuts at any other time in history. If you were to say in the Reagan administration or in the Nixon administration or in the Eisenhower administration, that there would be American weapons, American forces being used to target sites in Russian territory, in the territory of the Russian Federation, that would be completely nuts. And yet, this seems completely possible. It seems completely possible now that the Americans can strike targets in Russia and that the Russians will not respond in a way that will deter or stop the United States from doing that. And that is an astounding thing. But this is an apparent fact. Why is it that they think they can do this? Previous administrations in the 20th century would never have thought that they could do this. There's got to be a reason that they think they can do this without triggering a nuclear conflict. We just don't know what the reason is. I think it very likely has to do with an information gathering apparatus in Russia that's extremely, extremely good. I think that the Biden administration has, the American state has, extraordinarily detailed day-to-day reports on what's being said in the Kremlin that is emboldening it to act in the way that it's acting. Because if you didn't know what the Russians were saying to each other, you couldn't act like this. You would have to be more concerned about the nuclear threat. The Kremlin must be absolutely full of bugs. It must be leaking to high heaven continuously all the time. And that would also explain why it is that the Biden administration never tells us about why it thinks it can do these things. It never feels compelled to say. And if it were that kind of issue, if people were really talking about it and the data, the internal polling suggested that this was a major liability for the Democrats, they would have done something to explain the behavior. They didn't feel any need to explain it, which is incredible. the United States strikes targets in Russia and
Mhm.
doesn't feel the need to explain it.
Right.
Something is going on there. But to actually get to the bottom of what that is, I just don't think we have the information to be able to say definitively. We can guess, we can make theories. But the thing is, people are not making theories that even pretend to fit with the facts. They're making theories that are what their audiences want to hear.
Like, give me an example of the kind of theory that is being put forward that fits with what their audiences want to hear.
Well, that would involve something like, oh, the Ukrainians are reckless and stupid and irrational in their decision to go into into Russian territory and occupy some of it. That this will just result in enormous casualties for the Ukrainians, and then the Ukrainians will run out of weapons and the whole front will collapse. And that this is just foolishness on their part. They're just being completely foolish, right? Well, there's no thought there about why is it that the United States would encourage or permit Ukraine to do that. There isn't even an account of what is the thinking that would be behind such a move. Just everything the Ukrainians has done is framed as crazy or irrational or unreasonable, unstrategic, doomed very obviously to failure. There's no attempt even to enter the minds of the Ukrainian commanders or the Biden administration or to understand what is the point of view or the imminent self-understanding that's motivating the behavior. There's no attempt at all to understand or comprehend any of that. They just don't care because they're not actually interested in reporting on anything that's going on. And I could have some of this wrong. I could have some facts wrong. I could miss various things. We all, in trying to understand these very complicated situations, will get some stuff wrong.
Yeah.
The question is, are we even trying to understand it? And I don't think that most of the alternative media is actually interested in understanding it. It's interested in generating sympathy for the Russian position, generating sympathy for the Iranian position. It's different flags in the profiles. It's side taking. It's propaganda for one side or the other side, to the point where it just becomes, well, whose state propaganda do you trust? Whose state propaganda is more consistently getting it right? Because the independent media is not actually doing independent reporting. It's just taking reports from different state-affiliated groups and treating that like information.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Now, I want to throw this on the screen in an effort to try to be critical. Elbows Unique says, if the mainstream news sources were right about Ukraine, Russia would have been defeated a long time ago. And I will say something and then throw it to you, but I will say that given the initial intention in Ukraine, which was to take the whole country, I believe, Russia was turned back. And I remember at the time, one of the people on the sublation team, Stefan Bertram Lee, said, when the Russian forces were turned back, that Putin had lost at that moment. Clearly that was an overstatement, but this outcome that the length of the war is not a sign of Putin's having a big win in this conflict. I don't think. What would you say?
If people think back to when it actually began, the Western media believed that Kiev was going to fall imminently and Ukraine would simply collapse. That was the belief of the establishment Western media in the United States. It was shocking and astounding to the Western media and to the Biden administration, which had offered an evacuation to Zelensky, that the Ukrainians were able to defend the territory at all. That was a huge, stunning thing, not just to the American establishment media, but to the American state, which is why every time Biden tries to defend his administration, when he was doing the interview after the debate to try to salvage the campaign, and he's asked about, why should you, what have you accomplished? Why should you continue to try to do this? Ukraine is the issue he talks about. Ukraine is the issue that Joe Biden thinks has been his most stunning success, because it's in Ukraine where he has most exceeded his own expectations for what he could do. That has to be grappled with. Why is it that Joe Biden believes that? To the point where he's, stumbling around trying to save his presidential campaign, and that's what he chooses to talk about.
Right. Well, I mean, to put it in, to steelman your position a little bit more, why is that the talking point that his handlers think he should be putting forward? I mean, Biden himself recently was discovered is barely there. I mean, even worse than we thought.
Well, this was in the presser. This was in the press conference immediately after the debate, where he didn't get the questions ahead of time, and this was an actual exchange with the press corps, right? This was the attempt to prove that he still had it and he could still do it.
Right.
So it had this level of spontaneity to it.
Right, which is maybe a point against you because someone says here Biden is demented. So maybe he's just irrational to do that. Maybe he's
well,
just out
but
of
see,
his mind.
this is what people have to resort to. They have to claim that state actors are irrational or unreasonable to make their theory fit. And this is, the Bush administration, back during the axis of evil period would go, oh, the Iranians are irrational. You can't rely on them. They'll do insane, irrational things with their weapons. Oh, the North Koreans, they're irrational. This is a propagandistic kind of thing that people do when they don't really want to engage seriously with how people who are different from them are thinking or behaving. They don't want to understand the motivations. So they go, it's just an insane actor. But you can't run a state and be insane. I believe that Joe Biden has sundowning. I think that probably after 6 p.m., he can't think his way out of a paper bag. But before 6 p.m., there's been plenty of evidence that he can still, at least a year ago, maybe today, maybe less so, but at least a year ago, he could put sentences together. And a year ago, this was what he was talking about. Why was he talking about this? Because they could not believe that they were able to preserve Ukraine at all. They were shocked that they could do that. That was a huge surprise to them. We have to grapple with this. The American state is doing better than it expects in Ukraine. And the other thing to bear in mind is that the American state has deliberately refused to give Ukraine all kinds of weapons that would be necessary for Ukraine to potentially win, which means that the American state does not want Ukraine to win. It wants the conflict to continue. Just as in Syria, the Americans backed off and did not pick a horse and permitted Syria to become a playground. Sometimes the United States, instead of trying to produce victory for a side, looks to produce a long, perpetual conflict. And the argument that Biden made in the press conference is that the conflict is strengthening our ability to produce conventional weapons because it's subsidizing the growth of defense manufacturing in the United States. Therefore, it has to continue so that it can continue to subsidize that. If you listen to the reports that come out from the people who lead the defense contractors, right? These CEOs have been telling their workers, it doesn't matter who wins the election. You can vote for whoever you want. Why are they saying that? It's because they believe that all of these conflicts are going to continue and that the arms orders that are going to come in are going to be roughly the same with Trump as they were with Biden, which means they expect Trump to continue the conflict in Ukraine more or less indefinitely. Now, maybe that won't happen, and that would be an interesting turn of events. But I think that we should notice and care about the fact that people are talking this way. And I'm not a professional journalist. It's not like I spend all my time just studying security issues.
Right.
And I'm able to notice some of these things. So why is it that people who run channels that are devoted to covering these conflicts aren't able to include these facts or make sense of them in relation to their own theories or accounts of what's going on? Why are they not able to do this? Because they're not interested in doing it.
Right. I want to point out that when I look at the situation in Syria, what immediately comes to mind for me is just it's not even a full concept or thought, just a feeling of despair. That not that I would want Assad to still be in power, but just I don't look at the situation and say, oh, I see potential for, for the workers of Syria or for everyday people in Syria or for stability to emerge easily for a liberal democracy to flourish. What do you think? Is my brain got the leftist, delusion still, or am I looking for something I shouldn't be looking for? How do you view that in those terms, in terms of looking for good outcomes?
I think that there's a possibility of some kind of peace, a
Mm-hmm.
possibility of that. Liberal democracy, that would be a big surprise.
Right.
But some possibility of peace, some kind of deal could be cut, which causes the violence to stop, and then some level of rebuilding to occur. But I think that for this to happen, from this situation, the Syrian state will have to make concessions to Turkey, Israel, and the United States that will put it in a weaker position in the long term than its position, say, in 2010.
Right.
However, many individual Syrians who were not part of the Alawite group might do better in that new Syria than they did under the Alawites. Possibly. But I don't think that that's going to be socialism. I don't think that that's going to be even liberal democracy necessarily. I think that, but it might be some level of stability. And when you're talking about a war-torn country, the horizon of possibility for me in Syria would be something like peace.
Yeah. Well, listen, we've got about 9 minutes left for my short story, which we were going to talk about, a coffee cup alien invasion story, which I was shocked to learn is coming up on its 20th anniversary. This is published online, so you would think it would have been more recent than that, but no, this short story was published 20 years ago. According to Grok, the Twitter AI, if you ask it what is Douglas Lane's most significant short story, it says a coffee cup alien invasion story. Because it got some attention. It got republished in Best of the Year anthology at the time, and caused a bit of a stir on in the publication itself. You could comment, and people were like divided over whether they absolutely hated the story or absolutely loved it. Genre readers, people who really read science fiction to get a sense of wonder, hated this story, and other writers tended to be, by and large, not universally, more sympathetic towards it. But what did you think? You read it recently. What do you think of it, Ben?
I think it makes a good point. I think people could accuse it of being a little didactic, but I think it makes a good point. And I think often these, conversations between two people over a cup of coffee, this kind of thing is rarely popular with the general public because it's too discursive for the public. But I tend to like these kinds of things. I like these little people get together, they have coffee, they talk, and what do they talk about? Where does it go? It allows you to do something almost like a dialogue, a Platonic dialogue, but within the framework of science fiction and in relation to something. So, I thought it was interesting. I think the point that you are making is an interesting point.
And just to be clear, this is a story about an alien invasion that the government denies is occurring, and that the aliens themselves are only imposing on the Earth in a very passive way. The saucers are simply in the sky, floating, but they have not made any overt action to contact anyone or to communicate beyond that.
And it's happening so slowly that you can act as if it's not happening, and it won't affect your life really in any way. Right. But the guy in the coffee cup date, he just can't stand that people don't talk about it and don't try to do something about it. It's very obviously this is going on. This is important. But because it doesn't affect people's day-to-day lives in any meaningful way, nobody is able to find it in themselves to care.
Right.
Foreign policy issues are often like this. They very often are.
Right. And also, I kind of cheat because I kind of imply he has some connection to the aliens in the sky. He in fact goes at the end of the story. It's suggested that maybe he's going to commune with them.
Well, there has to be some reason that he doesn't behave like everybody else. It's not that he's just a genius or he's just smarter than other people or he's morally better than them. he has to have a material reason to care. And that's what everybody else lacks. He's got a
Right.
material reason to care. And that's the great thing about the story. You recognize that it can't just be that he has a better character or that he's smarter. He has to have a material reason to care. And that's what's missing for everybody else.
Yeah, I would say that one of the points of the story is definitely that he does not have a better moral character. He's a little odd, but he doesn't have a better moral character. If I relate to anyone in the story, it's Shelley, his girlfriend, or no, wife. I think it's his wife in the story. Um, that who wants to deny it all and just keep going along with her life and doesn't want to get involved. I feel like that's a more relatable.
Well, that's interesting, Doug, because I would think that you would relate more to the guy who wants to talk about the stuff that nobody else wants to talk about.
Back then, obviously, I did. But now, 20 years later, I find him a little insufferable. I find the whole thing a little insufferable. and
this is the self-hating aspect to this, right? There's a part
right.
of you that doesn't like this story because there's a part of you that doesn't like yourself or your past self.
We'll say past self here. Well, I feel like it's a story that doesn't quite that there were people at the time who wanted it to be more clearly about actual contact with real extraterrestrials, not so metaphorical, or not just an analogy for the war in Iraq, and which is what I kind of felt it was at the time. And by the way, which I communicate very clearly, because it's, along with being a coffee cup dialogue story, it's also metafictional. There are these little asides just about me and my life at the time. So people at the time were feeling like my critics were saying it would have been a better story if there had been something that happened with the extraterrestrials, if he had to confront this other reality, but rather than just wallow in the stasis and maybe some feelings of smug superiority. I think that if I were to write something like this again, it would be longer. Actually, I did write a follow-up to it. It's my second novel. It's called After the Saucers Landed, and that came out about a decade later, and that was nominated for a Philip K. Dick Award, and it was a very weird novel. But at least there was some struggle to wrangle with the transcendent or the unthinkable a bit more, which I think might be what I should have done here. But this was a success on the within the milieu and the time that it was published. It did its job.
Yeah, it performs a different function by not going all the way. It becomes more of a commentary on actual life. I find it interesting that it was inspired by Iraq, because compared to any of the foreign policy issues that are talked about today, Iraq was talked about a lot more and was much more at the center of politics and political discussion. All the statistics from that period bear that out. So that you could feel this way even about Iraq, even about a conflict where we did have these casualty reports coming in and people getting blown up by improvised explosive devices, let alone to try to talk about that now. I think it's even more relevant now than it would have been then.
Well, the invasion of Iraq was a major political topic right before and after it happened. But by 2005, 2006, the majority of the population had looked away. And
statistically, in 2005 and 2006,
yeah,
more than 20% of the American population said it was the most important issue for determining their vote, compared to 3 for Gaza.
Oh, well, sure. I'm not saying that, but there was a sense in 2003 when there were the biggest protests of all of history were taking place in the streets of New York City and London, and the answer was on the scene, and there was a feeling, and people, by the way, were people who were apolitical, were calling me up and saying, Doug, when's the next protest against this war? Because I am opposed to this war. People who would never who I only burdened with my political talk before then, were calling me up because they knew I would know when things were happening. So there was a sense that there might have been a way in which the public, the organized public, could actually have some way of intervening to stop or at least mitigate U.S. policy. And I think it's Time magazine that selects a man of the year or something like that. I believe the protester was selected in 2003, 2004 as Time of man of the year. I may be misremembering this, but there was this idea that civil society was suddenly on the scene and had to be taken seriously. But by 2005, there was that had drifted away, and people were going to vote on it, but they had voted and reelected Bush, so it was a big issue. They had voted and reelected Bush, and Kerry was clearly not going to change the policy in any case, right? So the moment of actually wanting to intervene and organize something political had dropped away into a spectacle at best, and most people I knew didn't concern them on a daily level. They knew about it, they'd seen the saucers come, but then it had just been accepted that they were just going to stay there.
Well, I think it had this positive effect of causing us to rethink our narrative about Vietnam and why the Vietnam War ended. Because the inefficacy of that resistance politics in the 2000s, I think, underlines that the kind of easy narrative that it was the hippies that ended Vietnam, when actually McGovern got completely waxed in 72. Bush and Kerry, that was a close election, but McGovern got completely waxed in 72. I think that helps us to maybe rethink and reevaluate the early 70s, what actually was going on back then. There's a lot of 70s nostalgia, and it comes back over and over again. People wishing that the 70s had meant something other than what they actually meant, which was the collapse and retrenchment of what had come before into something less effective and less ultimately capable of delivering anything.
Right. Well, I mean, I grew up, I was born in 1970, grew up as a child in the 70s, and then, came of age in the 80s and 90s. And when I thought of the 70s, I thought of the 70s as an embarrassment in the 80s and 90s. The 70s kind of came back in the 90s, and I was really surprised because, like, bell bottoms and meditation and crystals and self-help and all these things that we'd spent a decade making fun of. Now suddenly, this kind of it was called the me decade, the culture of narcissism was written in the 70s.
Yeah, the left is desperate to redeem the 70s and turn it into something that was actually a win for it. The left is desperate to convince itself that murdering people and supporting various foreign states and foreign military movements, that's a way to do socialism. So every opportunity that there is to try to rewrite the history of the 70s and make them have a different meaning or a different outcome, there's always a chunk of people who are looking to do that. Because there's a chunk of people who want to think that the problem is just that the left isn't radical enough and isn't wild enough.
Right. Yeah, and it's clearly not it. Okay, well, listen, we've come up to just over an hour. There's going to be a parrot room around in 15 minutes or so. I will put up a link. This time I'm going to really pay attention when I take the Zoom call that I'm going to put a link to and put it on the stream and make sure everyone who's watching it on YouTube can hear us. Because last week I left the audio off at the beginning. We'll be talking about Saul Alinksy and organizing and anything else people want to bring up as we enter into the new year, which I hope will be defined by the campaign for a Socialist Party and taking the criticisms of the left from people like Benjamin Studebaker to heart. So, you have anything else you want to say at the end here, Ben, before we sign off?
Oh, thank you guys for coming along and listening to our show, and I look forward to seeing some of you on the other side.
Yeah, come come join the Patreon. It really helps us out. I'm going to hit the button that plays the outro, which is the same as the intro.
In
Here
the
it is.
case of nuclear or radiological fallout,